Okay. I think.
Thanks, Dave. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shane McDonald. I'm the president of Vic TESOL, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to this Vic TESOL professional learning session. Our session today is titled Meeting Graduate Standards for Working with EALD Learners, and our presenter today is Dr. Jenny Barnett. Before I introduce Jenny, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I meet you from, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Badawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are joining us today. Just a couple of words about how this webinar is going to operate before I introduce Jenny. As this is a Zoom webinar, your microphone and video will be turned off throughout the session. However, you can communicate any technical or other issues via the chat function. We've also got the Q&A function available, and you'll notice that you should see that in your menu. And we're going to use that for questions for Jenny, which we'll get to towards the end of the session. Also, you'll notice in the chat, Dave has posted a number of messages to you all about different opportunities coming up for professional learning in Victoria for Vic TESOL and other members. You can get details from those by going to the Vic TESOL website, and the link is there in the chat. We'd also like to mention that for students in Victoria, membership to Vic TESOL is free. If you're undertaking an initial teacher education course in TESOL and for the first year after you graduate, so there's an opportunity for you to join. If you're coming to us from interstate and you'd like to find out about membership for your state TESOL association, there's also a link in the chat there that you can click on, and that'll take you through to the ACTA website, which is the umbrella organisation for all TESOL state and territory associations in Australia, and you can find out details about how you might join your state association there. The PowerPoint and the recording of this session will be available after this session on the Vic TESOL website. So I'd like to move on to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jenny Barnett. Jenny has worked at the School of Education at the University of South Australia since the 1980s until she retired recently. In her roles there, she worked in undergraduate and postgraduate teacher education programs relating to TESOL, and she also coordinated courses in TESOL in the Master of Ed and the Graduate Certificate of Education. She's also supervised doctoral students on diverse topics related to TESOL and literacy education. Jenny's been on an organising committee for several of the Australian National TESOL conferences in Adelaide in 2002 and 2018, and also in Alice Springs in 2009. And she's given a number of papers and been a featured speaker at various conferences. She's also a reviewer for the National Journal TESOL in Context. Jenny's been closely involved in the development of the professional standards, the elaborations for the professional standards for TESOL practitioners, and she was the convener of the working group that developed these elaborations. The elaborations are available for you to download from the ACTA website, and we'll put the link in the chat there for you to be able to access those. Today's session has been organised to introduce initial teacher education students currently undertaking a teacher qualification and who are likely to be working with EALD students during their practicums and once they begin employment. So in today's session, Jenny's going to take us through some of the thinking behind the document, the elaborations document, and show how it can serve you both in your preparation and in your practice. Now, I'm aware we've got participants from all around Australia today, and we've also got some people here who are not currently, or who are already qualified and working as teachers or in other capacities. And I'm sure you'll also find that what Jenny's got to say will be of great value for your understanding and your work. So just to get started, before we begin, when you registered, you did a poll about your familiarity with the TESOL standards, but we want to run another short poll just to find out about your familiarity with the EALD elaborations of those standards. So I'm going to launch a poll which should appear on your screen, And I'd like you all to just have a think about how familiar you are with the elaborations and cast your vote on this poll. I'll just give you a minute or so to do that. Okay. We've currently got about 95 people here, and I can see nearly 80 of you have voted. Just a second more. Any last votes? Okay, I'll end the poll now and share the results. So we can see on the result there that there's about 61% of you are somewhat familiar, 31% are not at all familiar, and a small number of you are very familiar. So a bit of a range here for finding out a bit more about the EAL elaborations. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jenny to talk to you about the EAL elaborations. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Shem. Well, I wish I could really meet you all. It's lovely to know that there's so many of you out there and interested in what we're doing. I'd like to just add a little bit more about who you are. You've heard a bit about who I am. There's quite a number of you who are planning on work, about half planning on working with primary students, and about the other half with secondary, and some with both. There's a few planning on working with adults, not so many. And somebody has just emailed me, and I have to get rid of the email, would you believe? That's better. And about 30 of you, I believe, are planning on working with Indigenous students, and the majority with migrants and refugees. So we'll see what comes up in terms of the different kinds of needs that you will have. And I'll try and deal with all of them, which I won't be able to do. A little bit more about me is that I was involved very closely with developing these EALD elaborations. So I really do know them quite well. And I've just lost that screen, right. Now the first, it's going to be in 3 parts, this talk. The first part is the Australian Professional Standards. How do they support EALD learners? Now, you know, most of you, you're familiar with the Australian Professional Standards. They are generic. They're for all students. So presumably that means they will support EALD learners, and we'll find out how. The next part is about the EALD elaborations themselves. What are they? What's the thinking? And the last part is how can we actually use them? So starting straight in, how do the APST, I'll call them the APST, short for Australian Professional Standards, okay? So again, you'd be familiar with these objectives. They define the work of the teachers, and they make explicit, note that, explicit, elements of high quality, effective teaching in 21st century schools that will improve educational outcomes for students. Now that means all students, and that means that it's our job to interpret these standards so that they work for EALD learners. And then if we look at the idea of outcomes, what do we mean by educational outcomes? I like to go straight to the UNESCO 4 pillars of learning. The educational outcomes would be learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. And all of those need to happen, and all of those need to happen for all students. But that living together is particularly hard for some students, as you know. Okay, you all know these standards. Those who don't, quickly have a look. It's the professional knowledge, professional practice, professional engagement that I want you to think about. Those are three different domains. You notice how the first ones are all to do with knowing, and then we get into the practice, and actually engaging in professional learning is a high standard priority, and professionally with colleagues, parents, carers, and the community, which means, as you probably know, about 25% of the Australian population is immigrant. So that community needs to be engaged with, not put to one side. Okay. So where would you expect the national standards to refer to learners of English as an additional language or dialect, EALD? Where would you expect to see it? Just think for a moment. Is it knowing? Is it doing? Is it engaging? There's only one place where you might think that they are mentioned, here in 1.3, students with diverse linguistic, cultural, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So we have to seize on this one and see what we can do with it. So it's know students and how they learn. We need to know them. Diverse is really important. The EALD students are not one kind, are they? There are a million different kinds. There's so many who are at different levels of proficiency, different home languages, refugees, migrants, international students, Indigenous students. There's a whole range of people. And then I just want to take issue with that word backgrounds. At the time these standards were written, it was still acceptable, I suppose, to think about backgrounds, but you think about it. Is their socioeconomic situation a background? Do they leave their religions at home when they come to school? Is their linguistic level a background? Does the fact that they speak 5 languages, is that background? So I would like you to reinterpret that word background. Think about it as experiences, life. It's real. It's ever present. It is not background. Okay. This is actually from the ACARA website, but it just shows you the variations that we have. I'm not sure how much of it you can read, but I'm gifted, but I have difficulty sharing my ideas. Okay, it's very nice that they've put that one first. That the students are not defined by their level of English. They are who they are as real people. And we tend to think, oh, that's an ESL learner. And sometimes their friends or not friends, their classmates will say, oh, you've got to go to WOG English now. Not too nice, is it? So we need to think about the attitudes of those in the class as well. I wish I could see you. It's horrible not being able to see you. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, because those of you familiar with the standards will know that we have descriptors for each. We have the focus areas and each descriptor for each one. This is the descriptor for focus area 1.3, the one that we were just looking at. Now remember, this is know the learner. But for some reason, the descriptor has gone straight to teaching strategies. Why do you think that could be? Why is it suddenly that we've gone to teaching strategies, which should be in the practice section of the standards? Well, it's because this is the only place where diversity, student diversity is mentioned, is in standard 1. So they've had to put in the teaching strategies right here. And just as well they did, because it means that we can build on them. But you need to be aware, this is the only place you're going to see this requirement to be responsive to the learning strengths and needs of students from diverse linguistic, etc. But I do want, those of you who are teaching Indigenous will know also the proficient, the proficient descriptor is design and implement effective teaching strategies. I like that effective in there. It isn't in the other one. That are responsive to the local community and cultural setting. And they've used this word background again, and histories. So this is important. Both of these descriptors are important because they refer to teaching strategies that are responsive. However, they don't give us any indication that we need to actually know the students, know what they're like, know what their histories are. It's assumed that we'll know how to design and implement effective teaching strategies, and that we already have that knowledge. So you know that that knowledge has to be found. And often we find it by reading, by preparing as you're doing at university, but also once you get to the school, there's a lot of resources, and the students themselves are your best resource. I'm sorry, my mouse has decided to play hide and seek, and I cannot find the next one. I'll get there. I'll get there in a moment. David, can you jump me or not?
I can't. Could you press spacebar, perhaps, Jenny?
Okay, thank you.
Or forwards arrow?
No, none of those things are having any effect.
Okay. Do you want to just stop sharing your screen and reshare it again in the same way that you did last time? Sometimes this happens. Sometimes if you stay, sometimes it freezes. So all you have to do is unshare, then reshare.
I think I'm right. I think I'm right.
Okay.
So the next slide, sorry about that, people. What is needed to make explicit the elements of high quality, effective teaching that are actually going to make a difference for the learners that we're concerned about? That's our big question. So that takes us to the EALD Elaborations, because when the ACTA Council of TESOL Associations, so the Australian Council of TESOL Associations is called ACTA, when we looked at these national standards, we really thought we had to do something about this because our students are invisible apart from that one mention, and yet that one mention does allow us to interpret and build. So we got together, and it took us a lot of meetings across the country and a lot of talking and thinking, and we came up with that. And the reason we finally got that publication is that the Australian Institute, the EAL, who designed the national standards, took a look at what we were doing, said, yes, we like it, we will endorse it if you do certain things, like making the alignment more evident than what we had in our draft. We did everything they wanted, they helped us, they actually put it all together, did the tricky publication part. So these elaborations are endorsed by the national standards. And that is really important for you to know. So what do? They give explicit guidance on the nature of the EALD learning task. You know, the fact that you have to learn English, you have to learn about English, how does it work? And you have to know how to learn through English, how to access the curriculum, and how to deal with assessments, how to manage school. All of that is part of the EALD learning task. Also to give explicit guidance on culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and assessment strategies. So that is obviously important. Respecting and engaging with cultural and linguistic diversity. Vital. The word respect doesn't get enough use, I think. And the last one, of course, responding to the diversity of the EALD cohorts that we saw before. And as well, it reminds teachers that it's the responsibility of all teachers, whether they're teaching maths, science, whatever, to support EALD learning. And it's the responsibility of you people as EALD specialists to help them do it. And the EALD Elaborations is a tool for you to help them do that. Then we come to the role of language and languages in learning. This is just often forgotten. People talk madly about literacy, and literacy is being constantly tested. But for our students, it's the language before the literacy, or as well as at the same time. And it's also the culture that they have to learn. And then we also want to remind teachers that their own ethnicity, their own culture shapes their practice. They need to think about that. That we expect, Anglo people expect eye contact, for example. Well, that's not culturally acceptable for many of our students. You know this. Okay, so how did we do it? The elaborations do that. Make it explicit, make the elements of high quality effective teaching explicit in 3 ways. We provide actual elaborations of each standard. Then when we go to the descriptors for each focus area and career stage, we elaborate those, several dot points in fact for those. And we also link to EALD resources. So you'd be able to find those by using the document. I'm going to give you an example here. I'm going to give you lots of examples actually. So the elaboration of standard 2. The content for EALD is English. As I said before, it's learning English, learning about English, and learning to learn through English. So this particular elaboration emphasizes those aspects and makes clear that there is such a thing as EALD content, that students are learning content when they're learning English. This is just to show you the screen. You don't have to be able to read it. I just want you to be able to see the career stages across the top and how these elaborations, these dot points, elaborate the focus area descriptor at the top. So the top row is the APST and underneath is the elaboration. So they're aligned perfectly. This, as I say, is very important if you're talking to your principal, talking to other teachers. Yes, these are aligned with the national standards. And on the left here, we've got links to resources. They don't all work now, but they do link to something which you'd be able to find easily. Okay, how are they elaborated? The focus area descriptors, all those dot points, remember? So first of all, by incorporating EALD values and information. I didn't mention earlier, but the construction of the standards, remember, in 3 domains: knowledge, practice, and engagement. Not all standards, not all teacher standards across the world use those 3 categories. Some of them explicitly add values. And of course, values aren't easily measured, and so that's one reason why they're not included here. But what the writers of the standards have done is integrate the values within the focus area descriptors. And so that's what we have done too. We've integrated the values, and you'd be able to see those values, and I'll ask you about those values in a moment. So the other way, the second way that we elaborate it is by looking at a word like effective and applying it to EALD learners. And then, of course, drawing on EALD sources of knowledge, such as the intercultural officers that I mentioned earlier. Okay, we'll get some examples now. That's the AS, right. So the purple is what's new, if you like, what's different. Have a read of it. So we emphasize language and culture, the language and culture demands of your subject area, whether it's maths, whatever you're teaching at the time, history, and knowing what are the challenges for them in understanding and dealing with those things. So that makes explicit the focus area descriptor just a little bit more. We go to standard 4, create and maintain supportive and safe learning environments. So we specify culturally and linguistically inclusive and supportive of their learning needs. And that includes dealing with racism. In fact, we say that right here. So the first two EALD elaborations are use strategies that support a culturally inclusive environment, address racism in the classroom and school environment immediately. Whoops, that got rid of that one. Go back to it, because there's another target here, explicitly redirect racist language towards respect for the other. These are strategies which make explicit what is going to support EALD learning. Okay, now I've got a question for you. We won't poll it, but where do you think you would actually expect to see? Whoops, I've given you one answer already by mistake. So what are the core values that are expected of teachers working with EALD learners? What do you think? I've been rabbiting on for some time. What have you gained? What kinds of values? What matters? What is absolutely vital? So the first is to recognize and value all languages and cultures as central to learning, that you cannot learn without, in a school situation, without using language. And this is just as relevant for native English speakers. And the other one, have you thought? Cultural and linguistic inclusivity. That's a core value. Okay. So the strengths of the EALD elaborations, when anybody asks you why bother with them, this is why. Because they support the development of the necessary values, knowledge, and skills. And they speak to all teachers. And I'll show you a bit more about how they do that. They advocate for EALD learners, and you can use them as a tool for that purpose. And they link directly to the APST. Okay. So how are you going to use them? You're going to use them as guidance, as food for reflection, a tool for EALD advocacy, and as professional communication. I'm just going to run through those four. There's many other ways of using them. But basically, as long as you are at university, you use them in your assignments. You can use them preparing for practicum. You can use them in your observations, watching teachers. What are they doing? How does that link to the standards? So there are plenty of ways for using them right now, and also once you get into a job situation. I'm sorry about those of you who already are. working and very knowledgeable. So you're going to use them as guidance. Here's an example. We've looked at that word effective. What do you think would be effective teaching strategies? That should be something that you've been learning. So just one of them, the elaboration is that any useful teaching strategy is going to be responsive, okay? Respond to their levels of literacy and numeracy in both the home language or dialect and standard Australian English. So it's knowing what they can do in their own language. Gives them confidence, gives them self-respect, gives you understanding. And to help you do that, you draw on your EALD knowledge sources. Okay. And one way you can do that is using the ACARA documents to support English. They've got annotated content descriptions of not every subject area for some reason, that never happened, but we've got mathematics and science and history is there and English. So this is to help all teachers as well as EALD specialists, but it shows you what the language and cultural considerations are and gives you some idea of teaching strategies. This is a tremendously important tool which I think needs to be used by all undergraduate and qualified teachers. It's a very valuable resource. And you'll find the link if you look back at the notes to this PowerPoint later. So, EALD elaborations as food for reflection. Okay, so sometimes something comes up and you don't really know what to do about it. You might need to discuss. Maybe you want to do something which, like using the first language, is often an issue in some schools. Using mobile phones can be an issue. Let's look at it. So if you're applying knowledge, you've got to apply knowledge and understanding of effective teaching strategies, okay? This is to support students' literacy and numeracy achievement, still following on from the previous one. So you explicitly teach the language of numeracy and you attend to EALD development as a distinct component within English literacy development. Because you need to be aware that NAPLAN doesn't actually work for our students because it doesn't recognize that EALD development is a distinct component. I'm getting a bit dry here. So it gives you all that information as to what to do, and particularly those of you who've used systemic functional linguistics will know the importance of this. Going from spoken to written text, everyday to technical, known to new, concrete to abstract, okay? This is focus area 3.3, include a range of teaching strategies. The range is to use the home language or dialect, involving intercultural officers where possible. You don't have to know the language, although students will love to teach you something. Now, this is a challenge, and this is new to me, that particularly in secondary, but throughout schooling, students will start using online support. It could just be dictionaries on their mobile phone, and that should be something you can encourage, but not all languages are available on mobile phones, like Dinka, I think, still is not. Now, just think about it. Is it okay for them to use when you give them a text, when you give them something to read, is it okay for them to go straight to their computers and feed it in and get it translated into their home language. Doesn't take a moment for them to do. Then they immediately get some form of translation. It may not be very accurate. Are you going to worry about that? Are you going to say, is it okay? Is it not okay? They can quickly get the content, and they may quickly get translation and learn English by doing that. That's one of the benefits, but I'll come to that in a moment. I just want you to look at this other possibility, using an English translation of their own writing. So if they first write in their own language the task that you've set them, then they get it translated by Google Translations. Is that okay? Well, the benefits, you can see the benefits. Saves learner time, gives you the meanings quickly, helps them with their English. The risk, over-reliance on the L1, not reading and learning the English version. Well, that's up to the student, isn't it? If they learn the content and it helps their English, they probably still will read the English version. What do you think about using an English translation? It helps. They say, some of the feedback I've got is that it helps them to get their vocabulary. Instead of them always using the same simple words, they get some synonyms. It also motivates them to get started, and it builds their confidence. Now, one of the issues, of course, is that some of these translations are not very good, as we know. And so you need to use several of them to get accuracy. We might talk about that a bit more later. So that links to the standard 4.5 or the focus area 4.5, use ICT safely, responsibly, and ethically. Okay? So you may need to work with leadership in the school. And the EALD Elaborations for Leadership will say so. So that's where, again, if you've got the document printed off in your hand, teachers have found that very helpful. And as a tool for advocacy, they help to clarify the EALD learning task for other teachers. So that way you can use them with your colleagues whilst you're at university, but with other teachers when you get a job. They show how the teachers can support EALD learners to achieve their potential. That is vital. And they serve as a resource for planning whole school professional learning. That too has been found to be extremely useful when you get all staff on board. And as professional communication, this is probably most relevant to you people at university. It provides ways of understanding and talking about the EALD learning task. Shows your professionalism, shows that you know what's what. It helps you to plan your professional learning. It helps to interpret student behavior and teacher practices as well. So all of those are ways of using the elaborations. Use them any way you can. They're designed for you. Thank you. I can't hear the clapping, but if you have questions, please send them in and they'll be compiled.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for your presentation. And I'll invite everyone to put any questions you have in the Q&A function, which you should see along the menu on your screen. There's a question there in the Q&A, which I'll read out for Jenny. But Francis asks, what happens if the teacher that I observed didn't apply any of the EAL strategies in the classroom to the EAL learners in the class? So Francis is talking about her experience within a school. The child just sat in the class without knowing what's going on. I know this is a tricky question, but I want to know the answer.
How brave are you, Francis? That's part of the answer. If that teacher is going to report on you, then you have to wait and hang in and sometimes find a way. If you are going to have a chance to teach when that teacher is in the classroom, then model exactly what you think should have been done, show and add notes, give handouts, do the very, very best you can to model what you think should have been done. I think that's the best I can do. Very tricky.
Another question from Vicky. How would you advocate for an EAL program that incorporates students that are not funded yet, would definitely benefit from some EAL intervention or adaptation?
Yes, indeed. Well, it's working with colleagues. Do you know, sometimes you can't do everything on your own. So the thing is to find somebody who thinks along the same lines as you and work together. And sometimes what teachers have done in school is two teachers working together, involving all the learners in the classroom, giving the same support through handouts, through activities to all the students. And then they talk about that together at a staff meeting. So what they do is they trial something. They tell people that we're trialing this way of helping all students. And then they have, as part of staff meeting, a 10-minute talk on it and show what they've achieved and what the pitfalls were and how they adapted and so on. That's one way.
Another question. I received feedback from EALD learners during placement that I needed to speak slower. It sounds easy, but I find it hard to actually do in practice. Do you have any advice on making sure you do this as a teacher?
Practice, practice, practice. Yes, it is hard to do, depending on what kind of personality you have. But you could also remember that it does help all students. Speaking more slowly has a calming effect on the class and actually gives everybody a chance to pick up on the meanings. But if it's feedback you got, they are absolutely right. Another way is writing key words on the blackboard, whiteboard, whatever board you've got, smart board, so that they've got the key words. Like one reason they want you to speak more slowly is because they haven't got the vocabulary. If you've given them some of the key vocabulary beforehand, that can help. But just practice speaking more slowly. It really has a wonderful effect.
Okay, next question. What are some of the practical ways for teachers to differentiate activities for EALD students?
Ah, yes, that's a big one. Sometimes people, so if it's actual activities, if you've got enough of them who speak the same language, let them go through it in their own language first, have some discussion in their own language, turn it into English, and report back in English. You can ask them to achieve slightly less than others, but that can be a bit demoralizing too for them if you make the task too easy. But it depends on the learners, obviously. It depends what their issues are, but sometimes they need to, they need longer to grasp what the task is. And so you can sometimes make it slightly less complex for them so that they can still finish it. It's very discouraging not to be able to finish tasks. I can't really be helpful because there's so many different activities and different levels and different issues that you're responding to different needs. It's really working out what are their needs.
Okay, next question. What is the best or easiest way to find out who the EALD learners in a classroom are?
Ask them is one way. It's not necessarily the best way because they don't always want to show up. But if they're still learning EALD, well, basically, if you go into if the teacher doesn't know to tell you when you're on prac, that would be odd. You cannot tell by the name of the student. You might have a very exotic name and be a perfectly fluent English speaker. So never rely on the names. It's really interacting with each student to find out what level they're at. But you asked for the easiest way. That would take rather a long time, but it's still essential to speak with each child.
Another question, can you please give some examples of using students L1 in the classroom?
Yes, there's a lot of lovely work being done by Jim Cummins on what they call identity descriptions, the identity stories. So people write in their own language about themselves, and then they produce sometimes a bilingual book. In primary school, a lot of bilingual books used to be produced with the help of a bilingual aid sometimes. Often with a science problem of some kind, you get them to talk it through in their own language. One of the things that is really helpful, I think, is allowing them to access the dictionary on their mobile phone, particularly secondary students. If you need to think carefully about when is the right time to do that, but it can save an enormous amount of time for secondary students. But there is an issue as to whether they're allowed to use mobile phones in the classroom. Mostly they're not, with good reason. Another thing is it's sort of respecting the fact that if you've asked them to talk about if you've asked them to do a maths problem and they're using their own language and you don't know if they're just having a chat or talking about maths, it's actually more likely that they're talking about the maths. That they will, because they want to produce a result. So it's also trusting them and giving them the opportunity to make the decision as to whether they want to talk in their own language and when they want to stop and talk in English. That's been trialed very effectively, giving them the power to make their own decisions. Now there's a very common term used called translanguaging, and a lot of work has been written about translanguaging, if you want to Google that, and how powerful that is in helping students both learn the content in whatever subject area, but also learn both languages and maintain their own language. I'll stop there.
Another question, EALD seems to be really political. You mentioned that the only standard we managed to get was 1.3, but you point to cross-curriculum approach to all standards. How did advocates for EALD lose the argument?
We haven't lost it. Aren't you training? I refuse to believe we lost it. In fact, by getting the elaborations as a document and getting it endorsed by EAL, we did not lose the argument. But unfortunately, we have to change the whole of society, and that's part of your job. It's part of everyone's job to just keep working away at it. But I don't believe we lost.
Another question, do you have any advice for teaching Indigenous students?
I haven't worked a lot with Indigenous students. I worked on the lands for a while. Again, the importance of listening, the importance of getting oral language, that's important for all students, but Indigenous students have that oral culture, telling stories, being supportive, and involving the whole community. One of the difficulties, I don't know if you're talking about remote communities or urban communities, but in remote communities, if you can involve the students in what the community is doing and using English around those things, that gives them some sense of wanting to own English. I think for all students, but Indigenous students in particular, is high expectations. Don't settle for low expectations. Constant encouragement, belief, and also recognizing that Aboriginal English is, some would say, a language of its own because it follows its own patterns, but it reflects the cultural situation as well. It's a very powerful language. And so respecting that at the same time as teaching and giving access to standard Australian English, that's important. Talking about language and showing an interest in their language. I'll stop on that one.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and this one's from Melanie. What are some good examples of pre-testing to gauge EALD students' language skills and background in my classroom?
Good question, and again, depends so much on the levels. I think if you were to look at the ACARA documents and the learning progression that is in the ACARA documents, just go to their website and look for the EALD teacher resource, and there's a learning progression in there which does give you ideas for what to look for. So getting students to talk, to read aloud, to read and comment on what they've just read, but knowing what you're looking for, and that's where the learning progression can be helpful. You can find a link to that easily.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jenny. There are a number of other questions in the Q&A that we unfortunately haven't had time to respond to, but there's some really good questions there. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you very, very much for providing really useful insights and information about the EAL elaborations and for demonstrating their importance to us today. This work's of enormous importance for understanding and making explicit what each of the national standards means and the implications for EALD learners. So thank you for your time and thank you for your work in this area. It's a fantastic asset for us all. And the EAL Elaborations document, there's a link that's been placed in the chat a bit earlier, and it's also available from the ACTA website. So please make sure you have a look at that. So without further ado, I'd just like to say a very big thank you to you for your time and efforts today, Jenny.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And to you, Dave.
Hello everyone, my name is David. I'm the TESOL Professional Learning Coordinator. Thank you for attending this session, and I'd like to add my thanks to Jenny for a fantastic presentation. I just wanted to go through a few things which I've posted in the chat function with you before we leave. So the presentation resources, so Dr. Barnett's presentation will be freely available to you on our website. You can see the link in the chat function if you want to download it. A recording of the session will be made available tomorrow. You'll also receive an email with resources and links to the survey and other things to do with the session tomorrow as well. Also in the chat function, you will notice that there is a lot of upcoming TESOL professional learning events. One that's particularly targeted at pre-service teachers is called Not Just Surviving, Thriving, Preparing for Your First Year of Teaching in an EAL Classroom. This is a free event. It's happening in October, and we've got a panel of 4 experienced school leaders to talk about applying for work in an EAL setting, talk about what to expect in the first year, and also general principles of EAL teaching and learning. So if you'd like to attend, we'd love you to be there. This is a free session, and yeah, the link is in the chat function, and that will also go in the email tomorrow. We also have other events that you might be interested in. Starting tomorrow, actually, there's an event called Culturally Diverse Literature Professional Learning Series. This is starting tomorrow with a panel of authors talking about why culturally diverse literature is important. If you'd like to sign up to that, you can go to our events page. We also have one on VCE EAL exam preparation. So if you're intending to get work in a secondary school and you want to teach VCE, this might be a good session for you to attend. We also have a free resourcing and networking session coming up in October. Jennifer Peck from the Merck will be there to talk about their resources, and there'll be a chance for people to share the resources that they know about, which could be really, really helpful when you get into the classroom, or even if you're already there. There's also information about the ACTA conference, which is going to be held in 2021. So all that information is in the chat function, and we'll leave the webinar open for you if you need anything from the chat function to click on those links. I'd also like to quickly mention that for Vic TESOL, student membership is free. So if you want to become a member, receive the discounted member rates and access to a lot of our resources, some of which Carly's also posted in the chat function. So there's a session on translanguaging, which might be of interest to you. Become a member. We'd love you to join up. Okay, that's it from me. If you would now like to express your thanks to Professor Dr. Barnett in the chat function, you can do so now. Thanks for coming.